Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. I am delighted to have Gary here. We've been studying the Gospel of John, and Gary also has been studying the Gospel of John in his master's program, and he's particularly focused on John 13. So Gary, welcome.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about your interest in Gospel of John first, before we get started?
Yes, I can. My interest in the Gospel of John began with an interest in ethics. And if you're familiar, actually, I have another slide for that too. There's a distinction between law and ethics. Those are two completely different fields, and lots of times people equate the two. And so I became very interested in the Bible in general, and then the Gospels. And then something that actually stood out for me is actually in the Pauline epistles in Galatians, is he has a list of virtues. And it reminded me so much of Aristotle. And so I thought, well, what if there's like some Aristotelian virtues that are undergirding the ethical principles in the New Testament? And I hope I'm not belaboring the point too much, but attached to this virtue list, if people know, like, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, long suffering, it's a commonly memorized section, is this quote attached to that from Leviticus where it says, love your neighbor as yourself. And I was like, oh, that sounds familiar. Those are on the words of Jesus in all of the Gospels. And it turns out Paul quotes that twice. James quotes that. The epistles to John quotes it. And so the love command kind of like is a thread throughout all of them. And so in the Gospel of John, the last of the Gospels to be published, it appears there also. And it has like a really unique iteration where John doesn't quote it exactly. He kind of echoes it and reforms it. And so that became just very enigmatic for me. And I really wanted to understand what was going on there.
Wonderful. I just wanted to make one connection. So after this presentation at 3 o'clock, I'm going to have presentation of a model that I have. And there, the model actually talks about the Greek virtues, the traditional virtues, the 4 virtues, and the Christian virtues, and the connection between them. So that's what is there in the model. So I'm very, very excited about this. All right, so take it away. Where would you like to go?
Actually, I kind of want to start with kind of a question to the group. The topic is the transfiguration and the foot washing. And the word transfiguration, if I want to make certain, does everybody understand what that is?
Let's do one thing. People are going to have very different levels of understanding. There are people who have studied it for like 40 years, and there are people who are just learning. So how about you describe it in your own words, and then we will ask people for questions.
Oh, that's perfectly fine. So what we'll start off is the transfiguration is a scene that is present in the epistle of 2 Peter. I have my notes right here. And is also in all 3 of what we call the synoptic gospels. So it's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And John's gospel is kind of significant in that it doesn't have a transfiguration scene, at least not in any kind of form that looks anything like what's in those other ones. What John's gospel does kind of differently, though, is it talks about transfiguration themes. And some of those themes are the glory of God and the character of God. And so there's this question, is John playing with the transfiguration, with this idea of it, and is he even familiar with it? That's another big discussion. So kind of what I wanted to do, depending on how willing people are in this, is I wanted to, I'll share screen now if this is okay.
Please.
And is everybody able to see that?
Yes.
Okay. So this is something called the Hermeneutical Circle, and it's the idea is treating the Bible as sacred literature. And when this diagram looks a little kind of goofy, is you have this context, this idea of what we think is going on in the text, and then we read the text, and then that changes my whole context and understanding of the text. And so that's the point two on this, is I have a new understanding, and then through my own reflection, I create a new context. And then when I return back to the text, it has a completely different meaning, or maybe a growing meaning, or something like that. And so the idea of the hermeneutical circle is that there's this evolution of meaning. What maybe seems plain and apparent, at face value, changes over time based on our own experiences, and maybe even based on our knowledge of the text, whatever is taking place. And so what I kind of had an idea of what we might do, and this is all very new to me, and so experimenting with this on Zoom is really scary for me, so please be a little bit forgiving. But also I want for everybody to be able to participate actively. Is the idea is going to take you through like my experience with this text and how I came to the ideas that I did. And so we're going to kind of go on a little bit of a journey, and we're going to be like kind of going in circles, going on this hermeneutical circle, where we're going to revisit this transfiguration theme, revisit what's taking place in John, and then seeing how the context changes. Does that make sense?
Perfect.
All right. So does anybody feel comfortable reading? And do people have access to a Bible?
Sure. If anybody wants to read, go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat. I just want to say one thing about the Hermeneutical Circle. We had several close associates of a gentleman called Walter Ong here.
Oh, yes. I read his book.
Yes. So he's done fundamental work on orality and literacy. And one of his most famous quotes is that all text is pretext. And my adjoining to that is that all text is pretext because it doesn't contain the context. So the idea of the text is to have it covered with this loop, oral loop of conversation, which is continuously talking about the text, and then that is getting reintegrated into the understanding of the text. So that is what, we had like 4 meetups of some of his key associates who worked with him along, did kind of joint publications with him to talk about just this point. So we have some base in that one. All right. What would you like? If anybody wants to read, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Otherwise, I will volunteer myself. What would you like to start with?
So actually, what we'll do is we'll read one of the Transfiguration narratives. The first one is going to be Mark. And there are basically 2 readings. One is Mark chapter 8, 27 through 38. And then the other right after that is the actual Transfiguration, which is 9 verses 1 to 13. If you want to read the first part, Shrikant, I'll read the second part.
Let's do one thing. Give me the second one. So while you're reading the first one, I'll bring that up. What's the second one?
Chapter 9, verses 1 through 13 in the Gospel of Mark.
13. Okay, I'll key that out. Key that up. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll read the first part. So the first part is, Jesus went out along with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he questions his disciples, saying to them, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, saying, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, but others, one of the prophets." And he continued by questioning them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered and said to him, "You are the Christ." And he warned them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he was stating the matter plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's." And he summoned the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." All right.
Wonderful. So I'm reading Mark 9, verses 1 through 13.
1 through 13.
I'm using the ESV version.
That is perfectly fine.
And he said to them, "Truly, I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God after it has come with power." And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses. And they were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah." For he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. And a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." And suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them but Jesus only. And as they were coming down the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead might mean. And they asked him, "Why do scribes say that first Elijah must come?" And he said to them, "Elijah does come first to restore all things. And how is it written of the Son of Man that he should suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did to him whatever they pleased, as it is written of him."
So that's Mark's Transfiguration account. And so what's taking place here, and I think most everybody here paying attention is probably aware, is that John is the last of the Gospels to be written. And so prior to the writing of John is this long tradition of the Pauline epistles have already been written. The Christian church is growing. The reign of Emperor Nero has already taken place. And during that time, the Christian church has undergone some persecution. If you're familiar with the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul, before he was the Apostle Paul, was Saul, and he also was engaged in some persecution going on there. And then also the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Roman general Titus in 70 AD. And so all of that destruction has taken place. And it's kind of laid on the scene that the Gospels are actually written after the epistles. And then John comes around kind of as the last of them. And so when we talk about the hermeneutical circle, part of what's taking place is that John is engaged also in conversation with the traditions that preceded him. And so one of the things I really like about the Gospel of John is that it's able to engage the epistles of Paul, the Christian traditions that came forward, and it's engaging in the synoptic tradition, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so when we look at John, and we say, oh, where's the transfiguration? How come there's no transfiguration? Part of what's happening is we can't like just assume that he's ignorant of it, because this robust thing has already been taking place. And if we're familiar of one of the things that Rome was most famous for was the roads, which were designed to facilitate communication and commerce. And so by this time, you know, it is like the assumption is that John is very fully aware of this. And so that's kind of the question that we're kind of going into this hermeneutical circle, is we're asking, like, what is the conversation that John is having with the New Testament, other literature, the stuff that came before, but he's also having a conversation with the Old Testament literature that went before that. Are we on the same page with that?
Yep.
Now, I guess the next part of reading is, if anybody wants to read, go put an exclamation point. And we're gonna go to Exodus, but for just 2 verses in Exodus, if anybody wants to do it. If not, that's okay. And I can read it myself.
Let's see. Joe, can I volunteer you?
You could if I had my Bible.
Okay, that's a good reason.
Yeah.
Anybody else can read. Reading is very important, you know. Katie, go ahead.
I can do a quick Google, because I was able to pull up from the Bible Gate. Can you tell me again which passage we're reading?
Exodus chapter 34, verse 6 and 7.
Exodus chapter 34, 6, verse 6. Because it looks like it's pulling up on my Bible Gate very easily.
Awesome.
Okay. So, let's see. 6 and 7.
Actually, could you read starting on verse 5? Is that too hard for you to change on the Bible Gate?
I can start at 5. That is not too hard as I'm pulling up 5. Then the Lord came, starting with verse 5. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. Exodus, strange for a second. 6.
I can give it a shot.
Go ahead.
You
Go ahead, Joe.
The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there, and proclaimed the name of the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abandoning in a steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity, sorry about that, of the fathers on the children and the children's children, to the 3rd and the 4th generation.
Thank you, Joe.
I want to say thank you, Katie, for making that valiant attempt, and thank you, Joe, for
Thank
being
you,
able to
Katie.
finish
Yes.
that out. And so what's going on with the Transfiguration, and this is something that just never occurred to me in all my years of study, is we see this Transfiguration in the Gospels. We don't see it in John, but what's taking place, and it's a type of what's taking place on Mount Sinai. And so we have, like, on Mount Sinai, there's thunder, there's lightning, and God speaks to Moses, and it's so terrible that people just think it's thunder. They can't even hear or comprehend the name of God in the context of what's going on in Mount Sinai. And that's where Moses goes up to receive the law. In this passage that we just read, this is one that I really like. Moses goes up a couple of times to Mount Sinai. And so what we have with the Transfiguration, when Jesus walks up to the mountain with his disciples, he's overshadowed in this cloud. And then what's going on? He's right sitting next to him are Moses and Elijah. And so we have like this vision of what was taking place way back in Exodus as the people of Israel were coming out of Egypt. And then there's this loud booming voice, just like the law that was coming down, that was given, to Moses. And then this command to listen to Jesus. And so we have this motif that's going on. That's a reimagining of the Sinai motif. And so that was something that it didn't occur to me until I saw it, until later on I was in school, and that's something I completely missed. The other passage that's really significant in this, and if anybody wants to read, go ahead and put an exclamation point, is Isaiah chapter 6. And this is something that, this is a really popular verse that people might already be familiar with.
Okay, let's
And
give
again,
a chance for people to volunteer. Evanique or Joe, would you like to volunteer? Isaiah 6, can you, Isaiah 6, which verses?
1 through 7.
Okay. I'm pulling it up as well. Isaiah 6, 1 through 7.
Right.
Go ahead, Joe.
I can give it a shot with the exception of the king's name, if you remember that.
Oh yeah, you can exclude the king's name, that's fine.
Okay. In the year that the king Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on the throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were the seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces. With 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, "Holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. "Woe to me," I cried, "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Up to which one? What number are we reading up?
That's
Okay.
perfectly fine right there. That's a good place to stop. So this is a recurring motif. This is. Oh, I just saw Connie in the chat. Say thank you, Connie. No problem.
Yeah, no, you don't need to pay attention to the chat. I will take care of it, and I'll bring it to your attention if there's something that, yeah.
All right. So this is the journey that I went on with what was going on. It's like, what's taking place? What's happening here? There's this transfiguration, and then I learned that the transfiguration is really echoing back to Mount Sinai. And then when you add to that is you see this resurgence of it in the context of the Jerusalem temple. So we have this idea of the smoke and the glory of God and the presence of God in the temple. And that's what Isaiah sees right there when he has this ecstatic vision. And then something wonderful happened. And so here I'm going to go forward. Let's see if I can find it quickly. Are people familiar with the story of Jonah and the whale?
Yes, but you can talk a little bit about it if you'd like, please.
Yeah. So the story of Jonah, it's a fun story. We always tell it to our children because Jonah jumps into the water. There sort of is, God says, "Hey, Jonah, I want you to go to Assyria, the people that have Israel in captivity, the people that are ruling you, and I want you to go preach to them and tell them to repent." And if you plot the course, if you know a little bit about geography or you look it on a map, God sends Jonah east and he gets in a ship and goes west. He goes in the opposite direction. He runs away. And so eventually he's in a boat sailing in the opposite direction. The ship capsizes and a whale swallows him, swims him all the way back out and spits him on the beach. And so then he goes and he preaches to the city, and the city repents, and God doesn't give his anger or his wrath at all. And this is what I kind of want to zoom in on, and I hope that you guys can see the connection, is as I'll read chapter 4, verse 1 through 3, after all of this has happened, Jonah is actually mad at God. And Jonah says, but it greatly displeased Jonah, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord and said, please, Lord, was not this what I said while I was still in my own country? Therefore, in order to forestall this, I fled to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, and one who relents concerning calamity. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for death is better to me than life. He's angry that God is compassionate and loving, and that God has saved the enemies of Israel. That's why he rebelled, is he wants to see the wrath of God. And for this, it's this interesting full circle thing for me, because when we think of Exodus and Genesis and Leviticus and the Torah, we think of the wrath of God and the thunder of lightning and the earth swallowing people whole and all of these things happening. And the story we read from Exodus 34, when God declares his character, that's exactly what Jonah is quoting. He says, I knew you were gracious and compassionate and that you would be kind even to the people that sin. And on top of that, that whole context there is right after the story of the golden calf. God gives people the law, and while they are there engaged in the covenant and ratifying the covenant, in the midst of all that, Moses goes up to get the tablets of stone. And while he's away, he returns and he finds they've already created a golden calf. They've already started worshiping the golden calf. They've already rebelled, and they don't even have a nation yet, and they're already immediately rebelling. And so this is like, in response to that, God says, I'm compassionate and I want to forgive. And so that's the context of what's taking place right there. So now we can just go forward to our next spot, and we can actually go to John.
Okay.
Does anybody have any questions in particular at this point?
Folks, Gary would like this to be interactive, so you're welcome to ask any questions whenever you have them. And we're going to just go through this entire exercise as Gary has experienced it. So he's walking us through this. So if you have questions, go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom at any point. Let's go on to John.
All right, so John, we're going to start with chapter 12. And this is like, for me, the scene that was really pivotal. It says, now there were some Greeks among those who were coming up to worship at the feast. And the context of this is the triumphal entry. This is Jesus, this is Holy Week. This is right in the context of Passover, which we just had. We're about to enter Easter. This is the last week of Jesus' life. He spent his whole ministry talking about signs. And whenever anything happens, we're in chapter 12, verse 20. For Ebonique, I just saw that in there. And every step of the way, when it talks about Jesus' death and resurrection and the sufferings that'll happen, he keeps saying, my hour has not yet come. And so this is the point where all of that shifts. Everything begins to change. And so now there were some Greeks among those who were going up to worship at the feast. And they then came to Philip, who is from Bethsaida of Galilee, and began to ask him, saying, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. And Philip came and told Andrew, and Andrew and Philip came and told Jesus. And Jesus answered them, saying, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. He who loves his life loses it, and he who hates his life in this world will keep it to life eternal. If anyone serves me, he must follow me, and where I am, there my servant will be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. Now my soul has become troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came out of heaven. I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. So the crowd of people who stood by and heard it were saying that it had thundered, and others were saying an angel had spoken to him. And Jesus answered and said, this voice has not come for my sake, but for your sakes. Now judgment is upon this world. Now the ruler of the world will be cast out. And if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. And so we have this very interesting motif. And I had us read the first Transfiguration because it's preceded, when we talked about all text is pretext, preceding the actual Transfiguration is this talking about Jesus, his death. He's foreseeing it. In fact, Peter speaks up and he rebukes him. He says, get behind me, Satan. And we see that scene throughout all of the Transfiguration narratives, whether it's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They bear that in context. Then you have this Transfiguration where this cloud and the glory, and it's mimicking the glory of Exodus on Sinai, where God's character is then kind of declared and spoken out. And so here we are, as Jesus is getting ready to go into there, as he finally says, my hour has come. And the hour that is taking place is it's time for the Son of Man to be glorified. And so we have all of these motifs, this motif from Isaiah, this motif from Exodus, all coming into play. And so for me, it seemed that it was more than just coincidental that you had this loud booming voice that was coming out of the heavens, and that it's in the context of Jesus declaring his glory. And if we wanted to take it a step further, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, and then they call him back to the Son of Man. And that's coming straight out of Strickland knows, because he went through the commentary of Aquinas, who even brings this up in his study of John. I went and read that a little bit last night too to catch up on it. Is the Son of Man coming in clouds of glory is exactly what's taking place. This is from the book of Daniel. And so when I talk about like this idea of the hermeneutical circle and these conversations that's taking place, this was my experience with studying the text, is that the text itself is having conversations with other New Testament literature, and it's having part of me feels like this is like maybe boring to lots of people, but it's also having conversations with Exodus and all these other steps of the way. And I feel like maybe seems like we get lost in the weeds, but as you start to go back to it, that's the whole idea of the hermeneutical circle. It just kind of starts to slowly blossom. It's like the layers on a flower or on a rose. It's petal after petal just becoming fuller and fuller. And so I kind of wanted to take you through that little aspect of it. And so at this moment, you have this echo of the Transfiguration going all the way back to these motifs from Exodus and Isaiah and whatnot. And Jesus is here presenting himself as, to go onto the cross. And now we can just jump straight to chapter 13, which is the foot washing.
Mm-hmm.
And what does it start with? It says, now before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that we depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God, got up from supper and laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. And so this is another kind of interesting thing that is happening there, is in the Transfiguration accounts, and you see this also in the Exodus accounts. There's this bright shining radiance. Moses' face shines when he sees God, so much so that he has to wear a veil to cover it. In the Transfiguration accounts, Jesus gets bright and his clothes shine bright like the sun. And so we have this focus on his garments, except his garments aren't shining bright and white. He's laying them aside and he's girding himself in a towel. And these are the garb of a servant. And so in my mind, what I see taking place is like this counter transfiguration, is that in the other gospels, you have this ascent onto Mount Sinai, and what John is doing is taking that motif and saying the real glory is more of a descent, is the transfiguration into the servant that's taking place. And he pulls all of this things, loud booming voice is coming out of it. And now we're talking about the clothes. He's using the phrase and the terms of glory are taking place there too. And so all the little pieces of the transfiguration and the Exodus account, and even Isaiah in the throne of God with the cherubim and the smoke and all that, is like all of these are all like little crumbs that are filling throughout, showing that there's real glory in the attitude of service with Jesus. Am I talking too much? Have I gone too far?
No, this is very good. If you would like, I can make some comments.
Yes, go for it.
Folks,
Yeah.
we can go ahead and engage in a back and forth. So firstly, this is a very profound point, the ascent and descent. The ascent is moving from the earth to God, up to God, or moving from the periphery to the center, if you will. But there is something that is coming from the center to the periphery. I could start by saying, God so loved the world. That's the start of it. That's start of the descent, something coming from up, down. That he sent his only son. So even the act of sending the son is an act of moving from the center to the periphery. Then what is he doing? He's actually washing the feet. He is God. And Peter's reaction is the right reaction. You are washing my feet? But that's exactly what the descent is all about. Of the love of God for us. And that is being transmitted. And it comes at a very high cost. But we'll come to that. But what I'm saying is that the ascent and descent actually completes the cycle. It is how the world becomes divine. It is the integration of the spirit and matter. It's not just matter yearning for spirit, which is its core, but it is spirit yearning for matter, which is its manifestation. So both of them. So let me go to Joe next. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just want to briefly comment because it's a very important point, especially considering the fact that the disciples were actually arguing about who was the greatest just right before that. So the idea that that God is washing our feet, it's an example of the descent in order to go, you go down in order to go up. And so this idea that it's one of service and sacrifice, that God is providing an example for all of man. That nobody is above another individual, and that there is there's a call to service. And this has resonated throughout the years, to a certain degree with the church. That it's technically supposed to be a call to service, whether it be, whatever religious institution, to some degree. So the importance of that is significant.
And my first reaction to it when I read this scene was first a shock. So he's washing his disciples' feet. And then immediately was, but of course, because if you look at his entire demeanor of how much he loves people, and he's doing things for people, he's exactly doing everything that this is completely consistent with who he is, what he is here to do, what he's doing. This is just a most dramatic way of demonstrating it. Gary. Oh, sorry, Joe, you had something. You wanted to say something?
I'm just reminded also of John the Baptist when they first interact with one another. And he's like, you should be baptizing me. And so that this idea that again, it's another that's another example that had come to mind when I think of washing the feet. So anyway, that was just something I thought of. Sorry.
Thank you. Gary.
Actually, I know you told me that you were going to manage the chat, but I saw that Katie wrote a question in there, and if that's okay, I'll
Sure,
answer
go ahead.
that question.
Go for it.
So Katie asked, how is the appearance of Jesus similar or different from the appearance of God to Moses? In the synoptic accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they try to portray Jesus as literally similar, as being up on the mountain as Moses was on the mountain, being shrouded in clouds of glory, being radiant like God. There is a clear analogy, which is why I read Isaiah 6. This is the chariot throne of God, and God's, everything is going on right there. And then the loud booming voice and this fear that they have, Peter is like, just doesn't even know what he's saying. It's like, well, let's pitch tents for these people. But which is what I do when Shrikant asks me to come speak for you. I don't know, it's just coming out of my mouth, and I'm so dumbfounded, but similarly, that's just what's going on. What John is doing is he's bringing us back to the Exodus account, and which is why so it is in the context of the nation of Israel building a calf and worshiping other gods. God says, my name, Yahweh, Yahweh, gracious and compassionate and kind to thousands. And then he also hearkens to this, we have this deep sense of justice. We all acknowledge that justice is necessary. And he says, I will by no means leave the guilty unpunished. And that it contrasts when he talks about punishing the guilty is in contrast to this overabounding thousands of gracious and loving kindness. And it's like, if you just turn around and come back, I'm there with open arms, ready to take you in. And so it's no coincidence that when Jonah goes to Nineveh reluctantly, and then gets mad at God for sending him there, he's a reluctant preacher, preaches a sermon he doesn't want to preach, probably gives a lousy sermon hoping that they don't listen, and to his chagrin, they repent. He's mad, and he's mad at God. He says, just kill me. He tells God to kill me. I have no reason to live right now. And why? He goes, and he quotes Exodus. He says, because I knew you were compassionate and slow to anger and abounding in forgiveness and loving kindness towards thousands. And so when Jesus is here in John, and you have the loud booming voice, you don't have the cloud of glory, but you have its glory. John makes it really clear. Jesus said, now I am glorified. And the next scene that we have is the foot washing, where instead of radiant, beautiful clothes, he takes off his garb and wraps himself in a towel like a servant. And he gets down and he washes the disciples' feet. And so what the similarity is that Jesus is demonstrating and embodying the virtues that we saw there. And that's the big difference between law and ethics. Law is a set of rules that are necessary to govern the behavior of a community. And that community is almost always pluralistic. Laws aren't there for people that are wonderful people. They're there for the rule breakers. That's why they're there, because we have rule breakers in our society. Ethics are the means by which we are able to critique. They undergird and create the values upon which the laws sit on those ethics. And so God's character in Exodus 34 is the undergirding, is part of the ethical undergirding upon which the law or everything else that can be known on God sits. And that's why Nineveh is saved when Jonah preaches. They didn't have to practice kosher laws. They were not the people of Israel with the 613 commandments. They were they were actually the dominant nation that God used to punish Israel. And now Israel was in captivity there. And God saves them because he's compassionate and kind and loving. And all he wants is for people to repent. I see a couple of questions.
Yes. Just a couple of things. Many of the presenters cannot handle speaking and chat at the same time. You are able to do it effortlessly, so go ahead and do it as much as you want. So next up is going to be Joe, and then I have a quick comment. Let me actually make a quick comment about the distinction between these gospels, because I love, Gospel of John so much. It's always interesting to see this. You're saying that the synoptic gospels focus on the transfiguration, showing the glorious, whereas the John, he's showing him as a servant. The interesting thing is that the synoptic gospels start by describing Jesus as a man, and then they have to kind of work to kind of show that, oh, he's a God. John starts with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So he starts right there. And now he's beginning to show that that is man in the fullest sense. So it's like he goes from God to man, as Jesus as God to Jesus as man, whereas the other ones go in the opposite direction. Joe.
Just really quickly, I really like the distinction between laws and ethics, because this is key to when you're talking about the idea of what it means to be human, in a way. The idea of being able to reason and rationally come to a decision using a set of principles like ethics, as opposed to using a law that actually may not fit a particular type of situation or human experience. And I think that that's a very important distinction, because sometimes these laws are then created and create power structures that then are in place that become obsolete, and they stop serving what they actually were intended to do in the first place. And that's kind of what the role of Christ is, in the sense that he's saying that you're hanging on, serving, and you're speaking about the laws, and here I am creating miracles and proving to you that God exists, that you're so hung up on these, and I use it, forms, and as opposed to thinking about what it actually means to be following God in the first place. So the function of it, and it kind of, to me, this just speaks to my heart in particular, because I think it also it serves as a warning of the difficulties with dogma in general. So again, it having a set of principles and ethics that enable you to actually think. There are still axiomatic truths, but it's allowing you the leeway to actually follow God and to really rationally think as a human being, versus just follow a bunch of rules that may not be good to follow.
Another logistical point I wanted to make is that this is really good to be able to discuss like this. So let us take our time to do it properly. Gary has agreed to do the continuation of this next Saturday at 4 p.m. So we will continue this. So we will go as far. So Gary, you don't need to rush anything in order to finish anything by any particular time. Just because I think the point about that you're making about the hermeneutical circle is fundamental. Like, this is very deep work, and you cannot really understand the Gospel of John without all those references going back. In some ways, let me describe it in musical terms. It's like Gospel of John is like a culmination. It's like that scene of Jesus washing his disciples' feet is like a culmination. There are all these little things, themes and motifs all over in this large work that is there. And it is capturing all of that. It is doing that with tremendous power. But in order to get its full power, you have to go back and get the thing. So thank you for doing this, because it is exactly doing that for us. Go ahead.
No, thank you so much. No, I really appreciate that. And that was probably more of where I was going, and kind of like, especially when we do this again, kind of inviting, as we can go the segmented ways and have people reflect on what new insight do I get when I read this passage in light of a conversation with another passage. There's also this really fundamental, principle is that the text of John doesn't mean anything if you don't read it. The meaning is a conversation that you have with the text, and so what it means to you, it only happens until you do that. And then you bring your own context and your own life experience is what's kind of reading into that. And so that's part of what's taking place is when we go through this and we look at it, then we reflect more, and then it has new or a multifaceted sense of meaning. Originally, like I told Strikantis, as I was trying to prep for it, I actually anguished for like 2 days and created like 3 or 4 different presentations. I wasn't sure what I should do and started with this full-on PowerPoint. And I was just like, I just kind of want to leave it open to you guys and figure out what you guys want to know. And then when next week comes along, I can build on what your questions are and actually have it directed, because this is your class. Also, if you disagree, like if I say something that you think, oh, Gary, I think you're far off, please let me know, because that's kind of, we're back to this meaning in this discussion. I'm really excited, especially when people disagree with me, to hear about different forms, different ways of thinking, because maybe there's something that I'm completely missing. But the next step that I was going to take is actually what Joe had brought up, is building up on this idea of ethics, because that's where all of this leads to. Does anybody else want to read? If not, I'll do the reading. But it's Leviticus.
Which one do you want people to read?
Leviticus chapter 19, but some very select verses.
Okay, so Evanik is going to read. Can you type in so Leviticus? Can you just explain?
Oh, do you want me to type it in what verses to read?
Yes.
There, those are them. Can you see that?
Yeah, I got it. Whenever you're ready.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So Leviticus 19, verse 17 and 18. Do not nurse hatred in your heart for any of your relatives. Confront people directly so you will not be held guilty for their sin. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against a fellow Israelite, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And then 33, 34. Okay, do not take advantage of foreigners who live among you in your land. Treat them like native-born Israelites and love them as you would love yourself. Remember that you were once foreigners living in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God.
Thank you so much, Ebony. What I love about going back to Exodus and going to Leviticus is these are the portions of the Bible that people usually just don't like to read, because they're like, I don't understand God. He seems like this angry, vengeful person. And the core virtues, fundamental character aspects of God are right there in Exodus 34 that we read. We see that echoed in Jonah. And then right here in Leviticus, this is the love command that we see quoted by Jesus all over the place. He's quoting directly out of here. This is quoted by James. The epistle by James in the New Testament is actually an exegesis of chapter 19 of Leviticus. It's quoted by Paul in Romans. It's quoted by Paul again in Galatians. 1 John goes all over it. And then now we're kind of ready to go into go back to John at the foot washing. So we just saw him. He's taken off his robe. He's girded himself in a towel. And unless anybody else wants to read, I'll read John.
Go ahead, Gary.
Okay. And so then he poured water into the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he had girded. So he came to Simon Peter and he said to him, this is Shrikant's favorite part, Lord, do you wash my feet? And Jesus answered and said to him, what I do, you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter. And then Peter said to him, and I love it in the Greek, I only bring it up in the Greek, not because I'm a Greek scholar or anything, but I love how he says, never until the end of time. This shall tell you, Eiston Iona, if you shall never wash my feet. And then Jesus says, if I do not wash you, you have no part of me. And so then Peter responds again to this, just as emphatically, then wash not only my feet, but also my hands and my head. And Jesus said, he who has bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you. For he knew the one who was betraying him. For this reason, he said, not all of you are clean. So when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined at the table, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord and the teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that you should do as I did to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, slave is not greater than his master, nor is one who is sent greater than one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. And I'll pause right there and actually jump forward to the end of the chapter. Is in 1333. He calls them, he says, actually, I'm going to back it up to 32. Actually, I'm just going to back it all the way up to 31, just because it gives the context. Please forgive me. Therefore, when he had gone out, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified. We have this idea of glory again in the context of the foot washing. He's returning to that. And God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and will glorify him immediately. Little children, I am with you a little while longer. You will seek me. And as I said to the Jews, now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. And so this is where Jesus, in the context of the foot washing and the transfiguration, is now tied together the Exodus motif and the character of God, along with the Leviticus 19 command to love the neighbor as yourself, which is also quoted in all three of the synoptics. And he's just kind of put it all together right there in the context of the foot washing. And that's really kind of where I was getting at. I feel like this would be a good place for me to pause or to kind of end it there, is that we have this love command that's taking place. And it's in the context of the foot washing. There is another facet of it, but I'm going to wait until Shrikant comment before I go into that. Go.
Sure. So let's look at foot washing. This is Aquinas' commentary on foot washing, which is incredibly profound. I strongly recommend it. So firstly, what is washing? What does washing represent here? Is that you're washing away the sins. It is part of washing away of the sins. He's doing this with his blood, with his entire, that's what Jesus does. He washes away our sins with his blood. He's doing everything he can to remove sins from people. Second, he's saying that if you don't let me wash your feet, you will have no part of me. If you refuse to be baptized if you refuse to wash away your sins. You will have no part of me. So let's look at just the interaction between Peter and Jesus, right? So he says, okay, so Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." No, okay, let's start with this. Okay, he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" So Peter is right. He's saying, look, you're God. You're my teacher. Why do you serve me? This is very different from the previous ideas of morality that people had. They say, you are the teacher, you are the God, I worship you. You don't serve me. So this is the reaction. This is the reaction that Peter has. So Jesus answered him, what I'm doing, you do not understand now, but afterwards you will understand. He's really teaching a new ethical principle here. That's what he's saying, that you do not understand the principle I'm teaching you right now. You do not know what it means for God to wash your feet, but you will understand it later. Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. This is not right. You are much higher than me. How can I let you serve me? Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no share with me. The principle is that unless you let go of your sin, you will never have a part in Jesus. You will never have a part in God. You have to let go. Those sins have to be washed away. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Here you can see the devotion of Peter. He says, I want to be part of Jesus. I don't understand what he's doing, but if that's what it takes, yes, I will do that wholeheartedly. Jesus says to him, the one who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. Now, this is his disciple. His heart and mind is already focused on Jesus. He doesn't need, so head is the mind, the hands is the heart, and the feet are the body, the daily commerce with the world. So he says, your heart and your mind is already mine. You already are completely committed. You don't need to wash that. You're already clean there. What you need is that you still have commerce with the world that you need to change. That is what I'm washing away. All of this is Aquinas, by the way, my interpretation of what Aquinas says. So please read it directly. It's far better than what I'm doing. And you are clean, but not every one of you. Now he's referring to Judas here. For he knew who was to betray him, and that was why he said, not all of you. Okay, so that is the meaning. This is actually showing you what Jesus does, is that he washes away your sin so that you can have life with morality, with truth, with goodness, with virtue, according to eternal principle or eternal life. So you have to, your feet have to be washed for you to have eternal life. That is what he's saying. Okay, next up is Gary. If you want to comment, you're welcome to do that.
Actually, I want to say, I really like, actually, I love your comments and what you have to say, and you manage this group way better than I do.
Okay.
So thank you.
You're welcome. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Evanique. Joe.
I mean, did Gary want to say something or no?
No, go ahead.
So it's interesting to think about what comes up with you, and I really appreciate what Gary has brought here today. This idea of having a conversation with the text. That I really liked when we actually connected it to Leviticus, and this idea of treating foreign residents as your own, and then not holding a grudge or seeking revenge. That these are principles by which to live by, and we can kind of relate this back to the way Christ treated the Samaritan woman. You know, he treated her with, he didn't necessarily look at her as having, you know, coming from a particular nation or a group. He looked at her as a human being. And this is a very important point at this particular moment in time. I mean, is that now God is universally accessible, and the way we treat people is ought to be with, you know, justice. So the idea, and the idea of not seeking revenge is a form of justice. That's something that comes up for me, that I think about. You know, do not hate your fellow Israelite. Rebuke your neighbor frankly, so you will not share their guilt. You know, these are very important universal concepts that are being introduced through stories, and being able to link it between the two gospels to me is very helpful, because when you're reading it, you can start to put connections together that you wouldn't otherwise have put together, and you start to see what a principle is versus something that maybe you think is a rule. Even doing unto others as you would have done unto yourself, that's kind of a rule almost, but what's the fundamental principle driving that rule? And to think about those things. I think that's very deep for me personally. So I appreciate you bringing up and the different gospels. So thank you.
Wonderful. This point about distinction between law and what Jesus is giving, it's like kind of moving it internally. Instead of saying, I will get punished outside if I did something wrong, you are moving that prime mover within your own heart. And you're saying, I will do what is right because it is right. I will have virtue. I'll have love of truth and goodness.
And that allows for transcendence of a sort, like that you're not bound to what the world is telling you, what the periphery is telling you. You're actually bound by what you are internally. It's your spirit, what you believe to be true. So that is a very powerful concept, because then it allows you to transcend whatever is being the rules of the day, and to actually do what is right, regardless of the repercussions. And that's really kind of what it means to be able to walk with God, is to do the right thing in spite of the repercussions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Great comments as always. Next up is Evanique, followed by Katie. Evanique.
Yeah, sure, Count. When you were reading the Aquinas and you were talking about the washing of the feet as letting go of sin, I had never heard that before. And it's very profound. And when I heard that, my thought was also forgiving yourself. That's part of letting go of sin. Not only not sinning, but also letting go of what you did. And I think when you said the heart and mind are already with Jesus, that's why only the feet need to be washed. And I was thinking of baptism, right? Because if you're baptized, that was also for the forgiveness of your sins, and that was your whole body. But the act of baptism and the real profoundness of it is that you are giving your mind and your heart towards Jesus. That's the act that you've already done. So now the feet, and I was thinking of that, and I was thinking of action in that hexagon that we were talking about. I think it was Thursday, and that Friday, sorry, when you were talking about the hexagon, and part of that being action. So I think that's the part that needs renewal, which is why there's a continuous washing of feet. And you wash your feet when you come in from outside, when you've been dealing with the material world. That way you can keep renewing yourself. You can, when you wash the feet, you wash the world away, in a sense, right? Like you're washing the world away from your feet, and any action that you've taken that takes you away from Christ, you're washing your feet. That way you can come back to Christ. That way your heart and mind will continue to stay in Christ. And so I was thinking of the feet because that's the action, right? That's where you walk. You walk in the material world, you take action in the material world, and your feet are what take you there. So I just thought that was all very profound. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Aquinas. I'm going to build on this tremendously in the meetup at 3 o'clock. I'm going to map this all, I'm going to map the virtues the classical virtues, the 4 classical virtues of justice, prudence, temperance, and courage. I'm going to map the Christian virtues, and I'm going to map the Old Testament virtues, which I don't understand as well, but I'm going to try to map all of them together and see the relationships between them and how they depend on one another and how they're different from one another in focus and in emphasis. Thank you. Next up is Gary.
I wanted to actually make just a short comment on Evanique. What you had this is actually kind of what I was hoping to achieve is that stumbling, like the baptism motif is something that people see a lot of in here. And so it's like, I got all excited when you brought that up and you're able to see that. It's also many of the commentators will bring up exactly what you just brought up. The idea is like, we're already clean, but we still walk in the world. And so the feet get dirty. That's just the way it is. And so the feet need to be constantly washed. And it's more exciting to stumble upon these truths on our own than to have somebody tell you them. It becomes more real. And that's the idea of like the text meaning something. And so I just wanted to say thank you so much. That gave me so much joy to hear your comments. It's like, oh yes, that's it. You got it.
We have great people here, Gary. I want to add one more thing. Just like each part of the text actually is responding to a whole bunch of text before, it is also a harbinger of what is to come. So for example, the reason I love this scene so much is that this is actually the first glimpse of what the crucifixion and resurrection is about. This is capturing it in a different way, in a much more milder way, but that's what it is doing. Let's go with, I'm going to have Jacob go and then Katie. Jacob, go ahead.
I actually put my hand up accidentally. I can tell you what I was thinking.
Go ahead.
On the feet washing, I guess I absolutely disagree with Aquinas. I mean, the idea that Peter's heart was pure is laughable, considering that he betrayed Christ later on. And there's a lot to the feet washing. One thing I like about it, it's hard to accept help. It takes humility. Well, it takes humility to wash someone's feet. I don't know if anyone's ever done it. It's a hell of a thing to do. It's an experience. Whether you're religious or adhere to the religious text or not, like wash someone's feet, and not your child's foot or your spouse's. That's something too, but maybe somebody you don't know well. It's a hell of an experience. It's really humbling. But it's also takes humility to let someone do it. A lot of people are generous and they give, but they won't allow themselves to be given to. That's a different level of humility. And so a big part of what he's teaching them is you have to accept help. So that's just one facet of the foot washing.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jacob. Next up is Katie, followed by Evanique. Katie, go ahead.
I think I'm going back to the foot washing, and then I'm echoing. I really enjoyed Evanique's comments about washing sin. And I think for me, I did a quick Google And it looks like at this time, a servant in people's houses would usually do the foot washing. So they'd have, so if you went to somebody's house. So I was trying to think of like a modern day equivalent. Like if you go to someone's house, maybe they take your coat or something like that. So I think that's part of the reason why I feel like Jesus is such a warm person, is I'm feeling this like hospitality, I'm feeling warmth, I'm feeling like service.
Excellent. Excellent, Katie. I mean, there is just so much here. But we'll go with Evanik first. Evanik, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to respectfully disagree with Jacob on the purity of Peter's heart. I think we can be of pure heart and still sin. Obviously, that's why the feet washing is necessary. So yeah, Peter was going to betray Jesus, but that was more out of fear, and Jesus saw that coming. And so I don't think it takes any way in any way away from Peter's heart being pure. I think he purely did want to serve Christ, and he purely did want to love him and be brave. But I think at moments we all succumb to fear, even though we don't like to admit it. And so in that fear, he did betray Jesus, but he also repented of that. So I don't think pure of heart means that you don't sin or you don't do anything wrong. It's that you recognize it and you repent and you go back towards Jesus. Just my thought.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit more about Peter and Jesus's approaches to his disciples. I find it extremely inspiring. And it is very different from how people treat each other. Okay. So firstly, he's saying he knows that all these disciples are going to desert him. He knows that. Okay. And he's talking to them. He's washing their feet, knowing that. Okay. Secondly, the feet is about interaction with the word. So there are three things, like you have to understand, you have to love and believe. So you have to engage your mind, engage your heart, and engage your body. The hardest things that these disciples are finding is the walking part. Okay, and they are actually going to walk away from Jesus very shortly, and he knows it. And he will tell them that you will all disperse and I will be all alone. Okay, he knows that. And he's doing this with full knowledge of that. Secondly, it does happen. It does happen. He tells Peter, you are going to deny me 3 times before dawn. And it happened. But when he's resurrected, he comes to them, and first words out of his mouth is, peace be with you. So you can see the level of forgiveness and washing away of all sins of all kinds that is there in the nature of Jesus himself. So I think that's a profound point. Next up is, let me take it back to Gary. Gary, go ahead.
So at this point, I'm just going to throw possibly a wrench into everything. Okay. And it's building on something you had said earlier about the synoptics and John and the way that they relate to each other. It's how it seems like, the synoptics start off with Jesus as a man. Matthew 1 begins with the genealogy of Jesus. Luke 3 has another genealogy of Jesus. And then John has, kind of like we talked about a counter transfiguration, as a counter genealogy. His genealogy is directly from heaven. So we have like this movement from earth going up in the Gospels, in the Synoptic Gospels, and then in John from heaven coming down. The Synoptics have demonic possession and exorcism. The Synoptic Gospels have Satan appearing to Jesus in the wilderness and tempting him directly. You have the manifestation of Satan. In John, something different takes place, is that you don't have an explicit temptation, although you have themes, echoes of the temptation taking place in his ministry. You know, in the context of the feeding of the 5,000, you have an echo to this where the people come and they want more bread. You know, and so it's echoing when Satan says, you know, take these stones and turn them into bread. And you have this resurgence of it. What John does is he takes the demonic, he takes this cosmic conflict, because we see this dualism from chapter 1, and he describes it in terms of the way humanity works in and through the world. It's no longer just a demonic possession or an exorcism that's taking place, but Satan is working through people. And what we see, and this is actually, if we go back into it, this is like really pivotal, is that this whole love command on the one end and the foot washing on the other hand is capturing a story of Satan and Judas. You know, and we're introduced to it. Satan already having put it into his heart to betray him, for Judas to betray him. That's the introduction to this whole story. And so, is it okay if I read the betrayal section? When Jesus had said this, he became troubled in spirit, and he testified and said, "Truly, truly, I say to you that one of you will betray me." The disciples began looking at one another at a loss to know which one he was speaking. And there was reclining on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. So Simon Peter gestured to him and said to him, "Tell us who it is of whom he is speaking." And he, leaning back on Jesus' bosom, said to him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus then answered, "That is the one for whom I shall dip the morsel and give it to him." So when he had dipped the morsel, he took and gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. After the morsel, Satan then entered into him. Therefore Jesus said to him, "What you do, do quickly." Now no one of those reclining at the table knew for what purpose he had said this to him. For some were supposing, because Judas had the money box, that Jesus was saying to him, "Buy the things we have need of for the feast," or else that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the morsel, he went out immediately, and it was night. So there are a couple of things. One of the things that I find just really amazing is it's night. And so for the whole remainder of the discourse, you know, he's going to go talk about the Holy Spirit and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit and being with us. The context is that it is night. This is that. Another thing is that he gives the morsel to Judas and Satan entered him. Jesus is about to go into a conversation about the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And so he's characterizing in the same way that the Holy Spirit leads us, guides us, and comforts us, that in the world there are people that have that same or similar indwelling. That's how the demonic manifests itself. He's not painting this fantastic demonic exorcism, fantastic stuff. He's just saying that this is what it looks like. This is when Satan works in the world, that it's really kind of a normal thing. This is the battle that we're there at. And I use the word battle because when we start talking about Satan and Jesus and God, we're introducing something that you see in many cultures, is this notion of cosmic war. You know, this light and this darkness is this cosmic battle that's going on in the forces between good and evil. It's introduced in John, and the whole notion or discussion of Satan really introduces this concept, and that's the tension that's taking place. What's going on there? And so what's happening with the foot washing is that's the battle. That's how we fight this battle, is by washing people's feet. And that's the paradox when we talk about the ethics versus the law, is what does it mean to be in the world and to fight against the evils of the world, it seems upside down. It seems counterintuitive. We want the glorious Jesus on the mountain that's surrounded by glory and has the power of God and the thunder and the lightning and opens the earth and causes all of this stuff. That's the kind of thing that in our mind we think is going to win wars and battles. But Jesus gives us a counter transfiguration where he washes people's feet. In the context of his own impending death, he washes the feet of even the person who is betraying him. And so that's, for me, where all of this went into, is this notion of cosmic battle, this cosmic war, and looking at it from an ethical point of view as opposed to a legalistic point of view, is that the war that we fight, the battle that we fight, is from the standpoint of service. By analogy, we could look to our own Declaration of Independence, which begins with, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And as a ethical foundation, we then didn't realize it at the time, took time, that, well, if all men are created equal, we can't own slaves. This is the foundation which allows us to critique law. If all of us are equal, then women deserve the right to vote. If all of us are equal, then we need to have protections against discrimination, against race, gender, religion, et cetera, et cetera. And so the notion of ethics undergirding law allows a critique of law also. That's my 2 cents on the cosmic battle and how service and ethics kind of work together to give us direction in life.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Gary. Folks, if you have any questions, comments, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Evanik.
Gary, I love what you said about Jesus washing Judas's feet as well, even though he knew he was going to betray him. And I think it speaks to us when we have to wash the feet of other people, even the people that, I don't want to say, well, yeah, I'll say it, people that we don't like, or people that we know mean us no good. And I think it's symbolic, obviously, but I think it's kind of like, I hate to use this phrase because it seems like so cliche, but forgive others as God is forgiving you. And to think about it as, how have we betrayed God when it's hard to forgive someone? And the beauty of forgiveness and moving on from what that person did to you. And I think there's so many things to unpack, but the beauty of that statement is Jesus washing Judas's feet and knowing what Judas is going to do and knowing Judas's heart about what he's going to do. And he knows that, and yet he still does it. And so it's a very hard lesson, I think, for us to forgive others who have betrayed us, who have not said they're sorry, who have not repented of it. It's easier to say, to forgive someone who's sorry and you think that they mean it. It's a very different thing to forgive someone who never asks for it, or who doesn't even think that they need to be forgiven. That's the real thing, and that's the real example Jesus gives us. So thank you for bringing that out.
Wonderful. Fantastic comment, Evanik. Next.
I have only one comment on what Evanik said, is in my own prayer life, is I've prayed for the people that have injured me more than even the people that I love or that I'm close to, simply because I know that I don't necessarily have it in me to forgive them. It's so difficult that I just, in my prayer life, I'll say I'm just going to practice forgiving them, in my meditation or in my prayer, until I have the strength to do it for real. But anyhow, that's really at the focus of nonviolent protest, actually. As Shrikant surely knows, Gandhi influenced Martin Luther King, and it was to look at the people that oppress you and just acknowledge that they're sick, that these are people that need help too, and fighting with them isn't going to save it. Is you have to acknowledge that these are injured people.
Thank you. I wonder, this is a very large theme. Gary, I really liked your kind of the comment at the end there of the kind of fundamentality of service. When people are looking for God, they're looking for this great, magnificent, luminous being with infinite power. And that's what that's what people immediately start thinking about. And what Jesus is doing is that he's flipping that over. He's saying it is within your heart. It is within your heart. The real principle is within your heart. And that's all you really need in order to transform the world. So it's a power of gentleness. It is the power of, transformation through gentleness. Like in Gandhi, it is all about appealing to the sense of morality in your enemy, of people kind of internally saying that, oh, what we are doing or what I am doing is not right. And that transforms, that's a far more powerful, transformative force. And that's what service is all about. When he's washing Judas's feet, he's washing Peter's feet, whom he knows is going to deny him. He's washing all his other disciples' feet who are going to run away. Okay, all of that he's showing, and we did not get to talk about what he says afterwards. So hopefully next time we'll talk about that in greater amount of detail, because he actually spells all of this out. And he says, let me now explain to you what I'm doing. What does this mean? And how powerful it is. So, I would love to go through all of that, but I think it's an incredible point. And it's the same to connect it to like Bhagavad Gita. When you say namaste, you're saying God in me greets the God in you. So what you're saying is that you have, no matter who you are, who the person is, you have the ability of saying yes to God, yes to Jesus, and becoming a child of God. We are children of God. We just have forgotten it. That's how Gita looks at it. So Bible says that we can be children of God. We just have to ask. It's raining down on us, that grace, and you have to have the love. And if you have the love, no matter where you are, you can do, you can move towards that. And that is the essence of forgiveness. It's a tremendous power. It is of saying that no matter where you are, you can go towards God. It's a very liberating doctrine, very powerful. All right, anybody else? So firstly, let me give you a heads up. I'm doing a meetup at 3:00 on my hexagonal model, which for some reason ended up being about ethics. Ethics is going to be a very large part of it. And we'll be looking at the same kind of themes, but in an integrated way between the transcendentalist, Louis Sullivan, Bible, Gita, all of it together, and mostly Carl Jung. So it is kind of another way of putting it is it is reintegrating Carl Jung, but unfortunately Carl Jung's psychological functions have been taken over by people who don't really understand the spiritual nature of human beings, because Carl Jung was also profoundly influenced by Indian thought. And his idea of self and individuation is all about getting to the center. And all right, Joe, but please be back. I hate to not be there for this.
I just need 15 minutes. But
okay.
Thank you, Gary.
Right. Sounds good. So that so I invite you to stay on for that meetup at 3:00. I'll be doing kind of a recap of everything that we heard, using that terminology, using that diagram towards the end of the presentation of what does washing of feet mean. I want to map that into the diagram. And what does law mean? What did Moses have? I want to map that into the diagram. How did Aristotle think about virtues? I want to map that into the diagram, and I want to see the relationships between these three together. All right. So any comments, any questions? You're welcome. Go ahead and type a exclamation mark. So if I always have questions and thoughts. So so Gary, this is very good. I really like this. What would you like to do next time? And next time, the thing is that we did not focus. I've talked about Aquinas' commentary only up to the Peter episode. The commentary after that is actually far more profound, because it builds on that and it says, okay, what does this, when implemented in the world, what does this principle look like? I mean, it's the heart of the church, it's the heart of the ministry. That's all it is. So go ahead, Gary.
No. I'm kind of at a loss that there's so many different directions where we could go. For me, part of the reason why we to Exodus and Leviticus, and then came back here and wanted to draw those links, is that we like to think of the ministry of Jesus as fundamentally new and different and groundbreaking, but it's the same stuff. As we're going back to the law, is like God's character was right there at the very beginning. And in the middle of this ordinances and this sacrificial stuff is to love your neighbor as yourself, which by the time of Jesus' ministry, the whole Jewish community acknowledged that this was all the law and the prophets were wound up in that command to love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And then when we look at the prophets, like through Jonah and whatnot, it was already there, that they already recognized all that stuff. And so when Jesus comes on the scene, that's part of it's like a continuation of a tradition that was already there. And then the other aspect of it is the cosmic overreaching notion that salvation in God's plan has always been for everybody in the whole universe, not just the Jews. And sometimes people have this really big distinction between it, but Genesis 1 begins with the whole world. And then that message is going through. So that's part of where I was going with that, and probably the applicability of what was happening and how it's a kind of a continuation of the same message. I guess that if we were going to go next, where it's maybe a little bit more on the Lord's Supper. Perfect. And how the Institute of Communion is missing. This is obviously the Lord's Supper. He gives the morsel to Judas. He does that in all the other ones, but he doesn't say, take, eat, this is my body. It's like, so what happened? Does John not know?
Perfect. I mean, John clearly knows all of it. But the thing is that he's been very selective in presenting things. And I would say, I see, just the artistry, just the sheer beauty and the artistic power of John is just way off the chart. Just how, it's like, just see how it begins. It's like, bang. I mean, it's just so incredible. And he's able to bring that kind of movements again and again, like this scene of disciples Jesus washing disciples' feet. It's so powerful. I mean, it's just like a cinematically or, artistically, he is a genius, he's a genius. So it would be very interesting to look at, kind of the meaning of the basically the bread and wine, and look at what is the equivalent of that, or how does John convey the same concepts in his.
I guess that's what I'm getting at is all these narratives in John are very meaningful and profound in and of themselves. And I'm probably less good at articulating it than you are, but what John's also doing is putting these in conversation with prior traditions, with Jewish traditions. And so whatever beauty is there in the text itself is magnified when you realize that it's all pointing and in conversation with other things there. And so that's kind of what I'm pulling into the text of John, is like, what are the conversations that John is having with the synoptics, with the epistolary tradition, and with the Old Testament.
Absolutely. I really, really appreciate that, Gary. I mean, the thing is, I have not read the Old Testament. So my entire base is New Testament. I'm beginning to read the Old Testament. I've come up to half of Genesis, and I go very slowly. I just talk to a friend of mine. We go back and forth. We just read it out aloud and discuss it as we go along. And it took us, I think, close to 70 hours to go through the New Testament. Old Testament is longer, so I don't know what we're going to do, but it is very rich. And the good thing is that he's able to go back and forth between New Testament and Old Testament. So I'm primarily interested in the New Testament. My entire and in that I'm mostly focused, like my mind is just focused on Gospel of John, because for me that's the most powerful moving formulation of the entire thought. But as I keep adding more things like Genesis, it just makes it so much richer, right? I just finished reading Abraham and Isaac's story before I went into looking at resurrection. And that was critical. That was critical. So you see that, and then you start to see connections. So I'm just delighted that, you've agreed to do these meetups with us, and we look forward to it. So tell me a little bit about your school. You have professors, you said, who have focused on John?
Yeah. So the professor
Which university is this?
Trinity Western University in British Columbia.
Okay.
And so that's where I'm at right now. Not physically, I'm in Vegas, but yeah, that's where I'm going to school.
Okay.
And so yeah, when I got there, is I realized that they had published, two of my professors have written books on New Testament, and both of them that I studied under last semester and this semester. I've written numerous journal articles on the Gospel of John, on the Upper Room Discourse, the Farewell Discourse, and then one of them who is published. That was the course that I just took, was with him, guiding us through the entire Gospel of John.
Wow.
And I feel bad that I wasn't able to, like I got so caught up in school and academics that I wasn't attending all the John lectures here. And I was like, oh, this would have been really, really great and robust for my thinking. But I'm an anxious individual. It's not clearly obvious up by now. So I was just like having some overwhelm.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I welcome you to stay for the 3 o'clock one. I want to give you guys a quick overview. We will be going through, give me just a second. Let me go ahead, and it'll take me a minute or so. Gary, would you be able to stay?
Yes, actually, I will be able. Oh, yes, I think I can stay for at least a portion of it. Yes.
Sure.
I'm going to
Sounds
take a
good.
break though, but I will be
Sure.
here.
Okay, folks. So we're going to start at 3 o'clock in about 8 minutes. So does anybody have anything? Evanik, are you there? I'm going to stop the recording and start